Gideon is the golden boy of the judges. He's everyone's favorite judge and most people's favorite character in the whole Bible. And who can blame them? With such relatable stories like his request for the fleece, where he asks God to make the fleece wet and the ground around it dry, and the inspiring tale where God whittles down his army to 300 men before he takes on an army as vast as the sand on the seashore. It's no wonder why he is one of the most popular characters in the whole Bible. However, the golden boy of the judges has a darker side that not many people know about. I believe that the story of Gideon is actually a commentary on the tendency of God's people to exalt one person into the position of a king or a god. At the heart of this story is a message about just how easy it is, despite the best attempts and purest of hearts on behalf of God's people and leaders, to exalt their leaders into a position that is idolatrous. Gideon's life, as we will see, is more about falling into idolatry than it is about taking leaps of faith. It is actually a story about Israel's first king, and no, I am not talking about Saul. It is about tribal rivalry, revenge, and the tendency of God's people to cut down one idol just to lift up another in its place. Today, we're talking about idols and icons in Gideon's life. Here we go. Okay, so let's recap what we talked about last time. Gideon has just defeated the threefold army of the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the sons of the east. Now he is going to pursue their army and specifically their leaders. What follows is a lengthy story that traces Gideon's pursuit of the kings and generals of the Midianite army. In this pursuit, Gideon will have three groups of people stop him and contend with him. And two of those towns will be towns that Gideon will exact revenge on afterwards. There will be two sets of leaders of these armies that are captured, two military generals named Oreb and Zeev, otherwise known as Raven and Wolf, and two kings named Zevah and Zalmunna. This pursuit will take Gideon outside of the Promised Land. I think that when Gideon physically leaves the Promised Land and heads east, it seems to be like he is also spiritually and proverbially going east into exile himself. It's like he is proverbially and physically going east into exile. This story of Gideon's pursuit of these leaders out of the Promised Land is actually eerily paralleled with Jacob's story when he returns to the Promised Land, except everything in Gideon's story is reversed. So Gideon will take the same journey that Jacob took to enter back into the Promised Land, but Gideon will end up leaving the Promised Land and take that journey outside of the Promised Land. So while leaving the Promised Land, Gideon will trace through the places that Jacob went to before he re-entered the Promised Land after his 20-year exile. Some things to be on the lookout for today. Remember that last time I said that Gideon's story will go from lots of sets of threes to pairs of twos. Today we're going to see a lot more pairs of twos and correspondingly a lot more contention and disunity between Gideon and his fellow Israelites. These stories are not as inspiring and faith-building as the story of Gideon's rise that we talked about last time. However, I don't think that should deter us from reading them because I believe they have so much wisdom for us to gain from. Particularly, I think that these stories will warn us of the dangers of victory and fame. So, with all that being said, let's jump into our story. Gideon has just defeated the threefold Midianite army, and now he is beginning to chase down the leaders and the men that got away from the battle. So we're going to start in Judges chapter 7 and verse 24. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down to meet Midian and take control of the waters ahead of them, as far as the house of Barah and the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they went and took control of the waters as far as the house of Barah and the Jordan. And they captured the two leaders of Midian, Raven and Wolf, and they killed Raven at the Raven Rock, and they killed Wolf at the Wolf Winepress, while they pursued Midian. And they brought back the heads of Raven and Wolf to Gideon from across the Jordan. Then the men of Ephraim said to Gideon, "What is this thing you have done to us, not calling upon us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they contended with him vehemently. But he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim not better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has handed over you the leaders of Midian, raven, and wolf, and what was I able to do in comparison to you?" Then their anger toward him subsided when he said this thing. The first thing I'd like to point out here are the words rock and winepress. We should recall that last time when Gideon was called by God, he was threshing wheat in a winepress, and then the first sign that was confirmed for him was when the angel burned his 3-course meal of an offering on a rock next to that winepress. So Israel's leader began this story timidly hiding at a winepress and expressed doubts at a rock, and now Midian's leaders are executed at a winepress and killed on a rock. They even name these places the Wolf Winepress and the Raven Rock after the names of the generals they execute. This seems to me to be bookending Gideon's calling. He's now come full circle. His enemies are now executed by his Israelite brothers in the same kinds of places where he expressed a timid and weak faith. It should also be noted here that while these generals are executed at a rock and a winepress, Gideon is not the one to execute them. Instead, it is men from the tribe of Ephraim. And I will just note here that these generals are executed west of the Jordan inside the Promised Land. This will become important later. This is important here because, interestingly, of all the conflicts that Gideon is about to enter into with his fellow Israelites, this is really the only one that will end peacefully. I know that I said Gideon is going to be quarreling with his Israelites, but as long as he is geographically inside the Promised Land and west of the Jordan River in this story, it seems like he's able to resolve his conflicts with his fellow Israelites. As we will see, the next stories which take place outside of the Promised Land will not end in Gideon resolving the hostility that he receives from his Israelite brethren. In fact, Gideon seems to display a lot of tact here. The tribe of Ephraim gets mad at Gideon for not inviting them into the fight, which, by the way, actually wasn't Gideon's fault. It was kind of God's fault. Let's remember that God whittled down Gideon's troops to 300 men, so most of these Ephraimites would not have been able to go to fight with him to begin with, right? This is interesting to me because it seems like these men from Ephraim wanted the glory that God actually desired to receive from this battle. Remember, God whittled down Gideon's army to 300 men so that the Israelites would not boast that it was their own hand that brought about the victory, and now Ephraim's mad because they didn't get a taste of the glory. From their perspective, Gideon didn't allow the tribe of Ephraim to share in the glory of the victory. In other words, Ephraim wanted the gold and the glory, and that was something that was supposed to be reserved for God. Gideon responds to their anger not by telling them, "God told me to do it, it's not my fault," or by rebuking them for being so vain to desire riches and fame. Rather, Gideon downplays his own victory and reminds the Ephraimites that they were the ones who killed the military generals, that they got the glory that was greater than Gideon's glory. In other words, Gideon told them that they got more glory than he did. He's essentially stroking their egos to avoid any further conflict with them. I should say that there's a lot of tact on behalf of Gideon here. The once timid wheat farmer is now delegating troops, handling egos, and avoiding internal conflict for the greater good of God's people. But sadly, this tact and unity from Gideon won't last long. So let's keep going in the story. Judges 8, starting in verse 4. Then Gideon and the 300 men who were with him came to the Jordan and crossed over, exhausted yet still pursuing. And he said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zivah and Salmunah, the kings of Midian." But the leaders of Succoth said, "Is the palm of Zivah and Salmunah already in your hand that we should give you bread to your army?" So Gideon said, "For this, when Yahweh has handed over to me Zevah and Zalmunna, I will thrash your flesh with thorns and thistles of the wilderness." Then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke similarly to them. And the men of Penuel answered him, just as the men of Succoth had answered them. So he said to the men of Penuel, "When I return safely, I will tear down this tower." Now Zevah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their camps with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left in the entire camp of the sons of the east. For the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in the tents to the east of Novach and Yogavach, and he struck the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. When Zevah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, Zevah and Zalmunna, and routed the entire camp. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a youth from Succoth and questioned him. The youth wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, "Behold, Zevah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, 'Is the palm of Zevah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are so weary?' Then he took the elders of the city and the thorns and the thistles of the wilderness, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. And he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city." Okay, so Gideon and his men cross over the Jordan River, and as I said, this is where Gideon begins to get extremely petty and vengeful. It's almost like a switch has been flipped both with Gideon and his Israelite brethren. When Gideon asked for Ephraim for help, they readily stepped in to track down and kill Raven and Wolf. But now Gideon goes to the towns outside of the Promised Land, both of which were places that Jacob founded and named, and these 2 towns both insult Gideon and refuse to help him when he and his men are in need of food. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, Gideon is reversing the story of Jacob and literally taking one of Jacob's most important journeys, but in reverse. So now would be a good time to talk about Jacob's story and his journey. Jacob's story begins with him stealing something from his family twice. First, he tricks his brother Esau into selling his birthright for a bowl of soup. Then he dresses up like his brother Esau and presents his father Isaac with, again, a bowl of soup, and tricks Isaac into giving him the family blessing. Esau is understandably angry with Jacob, and he wants to kill him. So Jacob's mother Rebekah sends him off to live with her brother Lavan, who lives in Mesopotamia, in Aram. Jacob then leaves the Promised Land and lives with his uncle Lavan. It is here that Jacob marries 2 of Lavan's daughters, one of which he is tricked into marrying. Jacob has to work for Lavan for 20 years, 10 years for each wife, just to pay for the wedding dowry for his 2 wives, one of which, again, he didn't want to marry. So after 20 years of working for his deceptive uncle, Jacob takes his 2 wives and all of his children and heads back to the Promised Land. And when Jacob nears the Promised Land, he hears that his brother Esau is coming toward him with what sounds like an army full of men, right? It's a lot of men who are with Esau. And remember, the last time Jacob saw his brother Esau, Esau wanted to kill him. Here is where we get to the towns Gideon visits. Before meeting Esau, Jacob makes a camp at a place just east of the Jordan River, and he sees another camp of angels. So he calls the camp of angels and his camp, this place, Machanaim, which means 2 camps. Pretty straightforward name. He made a camp, some angels made a camp right next to it. All right, this place is called 2 camps. After making camp at 2 camps, or Machanaim, Jacob sends over his family to meet Esau with a bunch of gifts. But he himself stays behind overnight, and during the night, he meets this random guy that turns out to be an angel of Yahweh, and this angel wrestles with Jacob all through the night. Towards the end of their wrestling match, Jacob refuses to let go of this angel, and he says that he won't let go until the angel blesses him. So the angel obliges, blesses Jacob, and renames him from Jacob to Israel. Jacob then names the city of where he wrestled with this angel Peniel or Penuel, which means face of El or face of God. He names it this because he saw God's face there and lived. So after that wrestling match, Jacob finally goes toward the Jordan River, but he doesn't cross it yet. He meets his estranged brother Esau just outside of Israel, still east of the Jordan. Like I said before, Jacob sends a bunch of gifts ahead of him, and now he calls these gifts a blessing for Esau. This is ironic and very fitting because Jacob is the one who stole his brother's blessings, and he's now trying to give back the blessings, quote unquote, that he stole. He's trying to make amends. And then when they meet, instead of trying to kill Jacob, Esau hugs and forgives him. The two are unexpectedly reconciled, and Jacob receives undeserved and unexpected forgiveness and generosity from his brother. So after this reconciliation with Esau, Jacob leaves and goes to another place called Sukkoth. This place means booths, and that's because Jacob built a bunch of temporary booths, some temporary housing there, presumably because he is about to make his actual home in the Promised Land across the Jordan River. So Jacob crosses the Jordan River, and the first place Jacob settles in the Promised Land is a place called Shechem. Shechem is going to be really important later on, but not right now. That was a lot. The important thing to remember here is that in between Jacob going from Penuel to Succoth, he experiences unexpected and undeserved grace and mercy. It should also be noted here that the number 2 is really prominent in Jacob's story. There are 2 camps at Machanaim, 2 camps. Jacob says that he sees the face of God twice, actually, in the story. First, when he wrestles with the angel, and then when he meets his brother Esau, he says that seeing Esau is like seeing the face of God. The 2s in the story show the reconciliation that Jacob unexpectedly receives with his brother and with God. They show that Jacob's blessing is the reunification of his family. His blessing is found through wrestling with God, through this strife and this contention that's like a healthy wrestling and a healthy contention and quarreling with God and with his family. And now he's finally able to make it back into his ancestral homeland. Okay, now let's connect this back to Gideon's story. Here, Gideon goes from forgiving the tribe of Ephraim inside the Promised Land, stroking their egos, making amends, keeping the peace, to crossing over the Jordan River and going to Succoth, where he contends with his Israelite brethren because they didn't give him any bread. Then he goes to Penuel, or Peniel, and the same thing happens there. At Succoth, Gideon promises to return and thrash their leaders with thorns and thistles. This symbol harkens back to the bitter work that Adam is cursed to do when he is exiled east of the Garden of Eden. God curses the ground after Adam is exiled that Adam would work, and says that it will produce thorns and thistles for him, and that's connected to how terrible labor will be for Adam. And ironically, now Gideon is thrashing the leaders of this town east of the Jordan River with thorns and thistles. At Penuel, Gideon promises to tear down their tower. Additionally, I find it very curious that Gideon does capture these 2 kings, and he does it by raiding the camps of tents, which are east of 2 places called Novak and Yogavach. It's also worth noting that while Jacob fled with his 2 wives from his oppressive uncle and is reconciled with his brother on his way back to the Promised Land, Gideon, on the other hand, pursues 2 kings in the glory that comes with killing them. And on the way, he leaves the Promised Land, and instead of receiving unexpected mercy and generosity, Gideon wrestles with these same towns that Jacob founded and exacts bitter revenge on them. So in Jacob's journey, he founded these 2 towns that Gideon visits in a time where he brings gifts to his brother. In Jacob's story, he founded these 2 towns that Gideon visits in a time where he brings gifts to his brother and is reconciled to God and family. But when Gideon visits these 2 towns, he asks for a gift in the form of bread and is denied that gift. Instead of turning the other cheek, Gideon, not Jacob, Gideon exacts bitter revenge and seems to exile and destroy these 2 towns. I should also note here that it is interesting that Gideon uses thorns and thistles to thrash the leaders of Succoth. Like I said earlier, these are an image of the exile of bitter work. It's almost like Gideon is so petty that he's reminding them of how they made his work of catching these two kings really bitter and hard and difficult by not providing him and his men with bread. Gideon even forgoes executing these kings so he can show them off to the leaders of Succoth before thrashing them and disciplining them with thorns and thistles. Oh, and before I forget, it's noteworthy that there are 77 elders in Succoth. 70 is a number of nations in the Bible, like I've talked about before. I say this because Jacob's house adds up to 70 people when he enters Egypt. This is really the first time that Israel is beginning to look like a nation. But I should also note that this is 77, not just 7, right? The number 7 in the Bible denotes rest and Sabbath and completion, because the Sabbath is on the 7th day of the week. Sabbath represents a completion of a period of time and also resting and ceasing from work. So it's really, really fitting here that there are 77 elders of Succoth whom Gideon disciplines with a symbol not of rest, but of the bitterness of work, right? It's like they were at rest, and because 77 elders, right? It's a number that denotes a nation and rest. And now Gideon's disciplining them with a symbol of exile from rest, of bitter work. This is almost a commentary on what happens to work when leaders and people don't work together, when there's disunity. Like, what is it like when work turns bitter? Well, what does it look like when work turns bitter? It is the disunity and lack of working together between Gideon and Succoth's leaders. But it is also the ego of an angry leader. When Gideon finally does capture these kings, he flaunts his achievements in the face of Succoth's elders. And then he gets revenge by essentially just torturing them. Leaders in a job place can make the workplace extremely enjoyable or extremely bitter and terrible. Egos and the desire to look good in front of others in a company or corporate setting can also make for really, really toxic work environments. Now it's time for our obligatory anime reference of the week. Okay, when I read this story of Gideon, it feels like he shares a lot of similarities from a pretty popular character from anime, from Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan. Okay, so if you haven't watched Attack on Titan, it's a great show. I highly recommend it. The main character's name is Eren Yeager. Essentially, the plot of the show is that there's this country that's surrounded by massive walls to keep out these giants that are called Titans. And these Titans are they're not like actual people. They're in like the shape of people, but they just eat everything, like animals and people that they see, right? They don't really seem to show any intelligence. So they're like giant people that act like animals and eat everything they come across. Eren, the main character, lives in this country, and in the course of the show, he gains some powers that really helps him fight these Titans. He becomes like a super prominent military figure because of his power and ability to defeat them. But as the show progresses, you see Eren go from this really pure, kind-hearted kid who just wants to free his people to a really cold and calculating political leader who's even willing to sacrifice his own friends at the cost of his own nation's interests in winning a war. Gideon, it feels to me, is kind of like Eren Yeager. A lot of people know young Gideon, the Gideon who is pure, idealistic, uncorrupted, like young Eren Yeager. But not a lot of people recognize or know about what I like to call Petty Gideon. Petty Gideon is like the man bun Eren Yeager. Petty Gideon is the cold, calculating, political leader Eren Yeager. It feels to me that here, Gideon gets quickly hard-hearted towards any opposition or tension with his own people. But like Eren Yeager, he still seems to have Israel's best interests in mind. And we're going to see why I say that later. That was my obligatory anime reference. Okay, anime reference over. Let's keep going because there's still more of the story left. Gideon has just captured these two kings, and we're going to pick it up in Judges 8, verse 18. Then he, that is Gideon, said to Zevah and Salmunah, "Where were the men whom you killed at Tabor?" But they said to him, "You and they were alike, each one like the son of a king." And he said, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As Yahweh lives, if only you had let them live, I will not kill you." So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise, kill them." But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. Then Zevah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and attack us, for as a man, so his strength." So Gideon arose and killed Zevah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent amulets which were on their camels' necks. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son's son as well, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. Yahweh shall rule over you." And Gideon said to them, "I would request a request of you, that each of you bring me an earring from this plunder," for they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they said, "We will certainly give to you." So they spread out a garment, and every one of them tossed an earring from his plunder. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, apart from the crescent amulets, the ear pendants, the purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and apart from the neck chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in his city, Ophrah. But all Israel committed infidelity with it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. Okay, let's talk about some names. Zevah's name means sacrifice. Zalmunna means shadeless or denied shade. Here, shade probably refers to protection. So these kings' names denote how defenseless they are and how they are put up as like a sacrifice of sorts to God. It is like Gideon is sacrificing these defenseless kings up to God, or is perhaps to sacrifice his own morals in pursuit of the glory that they offer. In other words, Zevah's name may be referencing to what Gideon sacrifices in order to capture and kill these kings. Now would be a good time to mention again that there are two youths or children in this story that Gideon tries to extort in order to do his own dirty work. The first child was the kid he captured and forced to give him the names of the elders of Succoth. The second is here, and it's his own son, who apparently was traveling with the army, who was still pretty young, but was traveling with them. He tries to get his son to kill these kings, but his son doesn't want to. So those are the two children. I want to focus here on what the kings say, though, because what they say is kind of peculiar to me. They tell Gideon that he essentially looks like a king. When Gideon asks these kings about some men they killed near Tabor, probably Mount Tabor, they tell Gideon that those guys looked just like Gideon. You know, they looked like the son of a king. And Gideon tells these kings that those men were his family members. Now that's interesting to me, because in the very next lines, the people will try to anoint Gideon as the ruler, maybe the king of Israel. So these two kings say that Gideon looks like royalty, and in the next lines, his own people try to make him their ruler. If it looks like a spade, if it walks like a spade, if it acts like a spade, if everyone says it's a spade, it should be a spade, right? So it seems like the obvious course of action for Gideon to do is to accept the people's offer and to become their ruler. But that's not what he does. He actually tells them no. And he also tells them that Yahweh should be their king, which, by the way, is really important. Gideon is the only person in the whole Bible besides Jesus to refuse to be Israel's king. This statement by Gideon will be important later on in the Samuel narrative, because even back here in this chaotic period of the Judges, Gideon seems to kind of think that even though he looks and acts like royalty, and even though the people ask him to be their ruler, that a human being king is a bad idea. He believes, as does Samuel later on in the Samuel scroll, that Yahweh should be the king of the nation of Israel. But I should say here that Gideon's response isn't entirely noble, because he also makes the people a golden ephod in a very similar fashion to when Aaron made the people a golden calf. And that ephod, like the golden calf, becomes an idol for the people. Here I'd like to give y'all a bit of a Bible reading hack, so to speak. So this has actually helped me immensely in my own Bible study. Something to look out for whenever you read the Bible is when one person is said to say something 2 times in a row. Whenever someone speaks twice in a row in conversation in the Bible, it indicates silence on behalf of the person that they are speaking to. So sometimes the Bible will have something that will say, "And Gideon said," and then it'll give you a line of speech. And then instead of combining everything that Gideon says into one line of speech, it'll break it up. It'll say, "And Gideon said," and then he says, "No, I won't be your king." And then instead of giving an answer by the people or continuing that line of speech, it'll say again, "And Gideon said." So if I were to make this into an equation, it would be something like person A speaks plus person A speaks again equals person B responded with silence. So whenever you see this happening, someone speaking twice in a row, it indicates the person they're speaking to is responding with silence. So for example here, in verse 22, the people ask Gideon to become their king. And in verse 23, Gideon responds by essentially saying, "No, I shall not be your king, nor my sons shall be your king. Yahweh shall rule over you." But then in verse 24, the very next words we receive are, "And Gideon said to them." And then we get this concession by Gideon where he requests that they all give him an earring from the plunder they got. So Gideon first responds to the people by telling them, "No, neither me nor my sons will be your king." And then he responds again. And this response again indicates silence on the part of the people that he's talking to. We as the reader are left to fill in the blanks here. Why would the people be silent in response to Gideon denying them their request to be their king? Well, because they're unhappy with Gideon's answer. It's a little awkward, right? What do you mean, "No, you won't be our king"? It seems like Gideon felt the awkward silence that this harsh answer brought about. And so he decides to try to smooth things over with the people. If he can't give them a king, maybe he can give them something to worship Yahweh, the guy that should be their king. So he takes the golden earrings they got from the plunder and turns it into a golden ephod. And this ephod becomes an idol for the people and is set up in the same town where Gideon previously tore down the altar to Baal. So Gideon sets up this ephod in his hometown of Ophrah, where he tore down his father's Asherah pole and altar to Baal. The same place where Gideon tears down an altar to a foreign god, he sets up an idolatrous monument in its place. It's almost like Gideon and God's people have a tendency to tear down one idol just to find another to put up in its place. It's like they're addicted to worshiping idols instead of God. This is why Gideon's name, in my opinion, is so important. The hewer, the axe of Ophrah. Because he gets his nickname and his own name from cutting down pagan idol shrines and ends up setting up his own idols in their place. I couldn't think of a more relatable story when it comes to our own individual walks with God and when it comes to churches and God's people and groups of people worshiping God together. How sad is it that Gideon tries to set up something which will help the people connect with God, but that the very thing that helps them connect to God becomes an idol for him in his hometown? I think we do this all the time in churches today, actually. Be it our worship of worship itself, or our worship of great speakers, or the worship of our Bible doctrines, or the worship of the almighty visitor at the expense of Jesus or his teachings. I also think that it's really easy to point the finger at other churches and say, how could they idolize that? When we ourselves are oftentimes steeped in our own personal idolatry of lust or social media or fame or acceptance or money or whatever your idol of choice is. Not to mention, it's really easy to spot other churches' idols, but to be willfully ignorant of your own church's idols. This is why I believe at the heart of Gideon's story, his name, the hewer, and the Baal contender, is important. This name, I think, calls us to both seek to do great things for God, to cut down idols in our lives and the society around us, to help God's people, but also to be a bit more introspective of our own idols, to treat others in idolatry with a bit more understanding and grace, be it people or groups of people, and to never forget to work on the idols in our own lives. That is the story of Gideon's life. That was kind of a lot, but we're not done yet. Next time we're going to talk about his son, Avimelech, and the first king of Israel. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you all next time.